My name is Mark Gordon. I'm 38 years old, and until June 29th, 2025, I was a career Marine. 3 deployments to the Middle East had taught me about death, about courage, about the thin line between this world and whatever comes after. I thought I understood combat. I thought I knew what it meant to face mortality. I was wrong about everything. The Arizona desert had been my training ground for 2 weeks. Night maneuvers, controlled explosions, simulated combat scenarios designed to prepare the next generation of Marines for the realities they'd face overseas. I'd done these exercises hundreds of times. The routine was second nature. Check equipment, review safety protocols, execute the mission. Nothing about that night felt different when we began. The exercise was simple. A nighttime assault simulation with pyrotechnics to create realistic battlefield conditions. I was positioned as an observer, monitoring the younger Marines as they moved through their paces. The charges were set to safe distances, timed to explode in sequence as the teams advanced. Everything was controlled, measured, professional. But something went horribly wrong. The explosion, which should have been 50 meters away, detonated less than 10 meters from my position. The shockwave hit me like an invisible freight train, lifting me off my feet and hurling me backward into a sharp rock formation. I remember the sensation of flight, the weightlessness for a duration that felt like eternity, and then the sickening crunch as my skull impacted the stone. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming. My vision broke into white, hot particles, and I felt something spreading beneath my head. Blood. A lot of blood. I tried to move, tried to call out, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs felt disconnected, my arms like lead. The sounds of the exercise continued around me, but they seemed to be coming from miles away. My fellow Marines found me within minutes, but those minutes could have been hours. I saw the fear in their eyes as they called for emergency medical evacuation, just before I lost consciousness enough to see their faces. Someone was pressing something against my head, trying to staunch the bleeding. Another was checking my pulse, his voice urgent and strained. Then everything began to fade, not slowly, but in waves, as if someone was gently turning down the volume and brightness of the world. The desert sounds receded, the stars above dimmed, and the familiar weight of my body began to disappear. I wasn't afraid. That surprised me. My lifetime of training had taught me to fight, to resist, never to give up. But in that moment, a strange peace settled over me, like a warm blanket. The last thing I heard was one of the medics shouting into the radio, "We're losing him." I repeat, "We're losing him." And then silence. What happened next defies all my assumptions about death, consciousness, and the nature of reality. I was no longer in my body, yet I was more aware than I had ever been in my life. The pain was gone, the weight was gone, but my mind was crystal clear, sharper than even my most focused moments in combat. I was standing, though I had no physical form to stand on. The desert was gone, replaced by what I can only describe as pure light. But this was not the harsh light of searchlights or explosions that I knew from the battlefield. This was a living light, a light that was warm and intelligent, that seemed to know me more intimately than I knew myself. There was no ground beneath my feet, yet I felt stable. There was no air to breathe, yet I felt no need to breathe. Time felt suspended, as if I had stepped outside the normal flow of existence and into something eternal and immutable. And in the center of that light, a figure began to take shape. Before he spoke, I knew who it was. Not from any picture or statue I had seen, not from Sunday school memories or religious imagery. I knew him because every cell of my being, every fragment of my consciousness recognized him as the source of everything that ever mattered. This was Jesus, not the gentle shepherd from the children's books, but the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. The authority he radiated made every general I had ever served look like a child playing soldier. His eyes held depths I could not comprehend, depths that seemed to contain all of history, all of eternity, all of truth. When he looked at me, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical nakedness. Every thought I had ever hidden, every compromise I had ever made, every moment of courage and cowardice lay bare before that gaze. Yet there was no condemnation in his eyes, only a love so fierce and complete that it threatened to overwhelm me entirely. "Mark," he said, though his lips didn't move and no sound echoed in that space. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating throughout the entire fabric of my being. You were not brought here by accident. What happened in the desert was permitted so that you could see what must be shown, so that you could return and warn those who still have time to prepare. I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions that filled my mind, but I realized I could not form the words. He smiled, and that smile held more compassion than I had experienced in 38 years of life. You will speak when you return, he assured me. But first, you must see. The time is shorter than anyone imagines. Before 2025 ends, 3 warnings will unfold upon the earth. Each will shake the foundations of mankind's belief in security, in safety, in the permanence of the world they have built. These are not punishments, Mark. These are mercies. They are the final calls to awakening before the harvest begins. The light around us began to shift and turn, forming images more real than reality itself. I wasn't watching a movie or a vision. I was witnessing the future with absolute clarity, seeing events that had not yet occurred but were as certain as the rising sun. What I saw in those moments changed everything. I thought I knew about the world, America, about the times we live in. The first warning showed me something that will happen in the Pacific, something that will drag our nation into a conflict unlike anything we have ever faced. The second revealed the collapse of the systems that hold our society together, a digital catastrophe that will cause chaos in every major city on Earth. And the third, the final warning, will be a sign in the heavens themselves, visible to every person on the planet, announcing that the time of grace is ending and the harvest is about to begin. Jesus showed me these things not as remote possibilities, but as imminent realities, events that will change everything for everyone, whether they are ready or not, events that will take place before December 31st, 2025. As each vision unfolded before me, I understood that my old life was over. The Marine who was thrown against that rock in the Arizona desert would never truly come back. I was being transformed into something else. Someone else, a messenger, a watchman, a voice crying out in the wilderness of modern America, warning of what is coming while there is still time to prepare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly what Jesus showed me, because every detail matters. Every image was precise. Every moment was calculated to convey not just what would happen, but when, why, and what it would mean for every soul on this earth. The first warning begins in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where American naval power has reigned unrivaled for decades. What I witnessed there will fundamentally shake our nation and mark the beginning of the end of the world as we know it. The vision began with water, endless blue water stretching to every horizon, the kind of immensity that makes you understand why ancient mariners feared falling off the edge of the world. But this was not a peaceful ocean. This was the turbulent Pacific, and I was hovering over it like an invisible observer, seeing everything with supernatural clarity. Jesus stood beside me in that realm of light. His presence was both comforting and terrifying. What you are about to witness will happen on December 14th, 2025, he said. The world will wake up that morning believing in the strength of American naval power. By sunset, that belief will be shattered forever. Below, I could see the ships, dozens of American warships arrayed in a formation that I somehow knew was the 7th Fleet, our most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Aircraft carriers that looked like floating cities, destroyers cutting through the waves with mathematical precision, submarines lurking beneath the surface like steel predators. It was a display of military might that had kept the peace in these waters for generations. But something was wrong. The water itself looked different. It was charged with an energy I couldn't define. And then I saw them coming from the west. Not ships, not planes, but something else entirely. Objects moving beneath the surface at impossible speeds, leaving trails of disturbed water behind them. They followed no trajectory I recognized from my years of military experience. They moved like living things, as if they were thinking, adapting, hunting. The first strike came without warning. One moment, the USS Gerald Ford was cutting through the waves, its deck a flurry of activity, planes taking off and landing, the eternal dance of naval aviation. The next moment, something struck it from below with such force that the entire carrier listed 20 degrees to starboard. Alarms began to shriek across the fleet. Voices crackled over radio frequencies that I could somehow hear despite not having a physical form. What happened next defied everything I knew about naval warfare. The weapons striking our fleet were not missiles or torpedoes. They were something entirely new. It was like a technology that bent the laws of physics. Energy weapons that could bore through the hull of a destroyer like paper. Electromagnetic pulses that turned our most advanced electronics into useless metal. And something else, something that caused the very water around our ships to boil. I watched in horror as ship after ship began to list, burn, and disappear beneath the waves. The USS Blue Ridge, the command ship of the 7th Fleet, was cleaved in half as if someone had struck its hull with a giant axe. The USS Antietam capsized completely. Its crew spilled into the Pacific like scattered toys. In less than 18 minutes, the most powerful naval force on Earth was reduced to floating wreckage and oil slicks. But the most terrifying part was not the destruction itself. It was the helplessness. Our sailors, the best trained warriors in the world, couldn't even detect what was attacking them. They fired everything they had into empty water. Their radar showed nothing. Their sonar detected only ghosts. It was like fighting shadows, fighting an enemy that existed in a different dimension. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to contain all the grief of the universe. This is not the work of any earthly nation, Mark. What you see is the first manifestation of powers being built in hidden places. Technologies born from alliances between human ambition and powers that should never have been contacted. Your military leaders do not truly know what they are up against. The vision shifted, and I found myself hovering over the Pentagon, watching emergency lights cast the corridors in hellish red. Generals and admirals sprinted through the halls, faces marked with expressions I had never seen on military leaders before. Pure terror, complete bewilderment. In the Situation Room, screens showed the last satellite images of the 7th Fleet before all communication was lost. 17,000 American servicemen and women destroyed in less than 20 minutes. Then I saw the ripple effects spread around the world as news of the disaster leaked out despite desperate attempts at concealment. Stock markets crashed in real time. Emergency sessions of Congress were called at 3 a.m. The president was moved to a secure location while advisors shouted conflicting advice into secure phones. But it wasn't just America that was shaken. In Beijing, in Moscow, in capitals around the world, leaders were receiving intelligence reports that made no sense. Weapons that should not exist, technology that violates every known principle of physics, an attack that was sudden and from everywhere. The second part of the first warning showed what would happen in the days following the Pacific disaster. America would demand answers, would mobilize every remaining military asset for retaliation, but against whom would it retaliate? The attackers had vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving no trace except the wreckage of our fleet and 17,000 families who would never see their loved ones again. Within 72 hours, 3 more navies suffered similar attacks. The British fleet in the North Sea was turned into scrap metal in minutes. A Russian submarine fleet in the Arctic was crushed by weapons that seemed to condense the very water into a lethal force. Japanese destroyers in their own territorial waters simply vanished, as if they had never existed. Jesus showed me the war rooms, the desperate conferences, the growing realization among world leaders that they were facing something beyond their comprehension. In panic, treaties would be signed, former enemies would instantly become allies, and the entire geopolitical structure of the world would be reordered around one terrifying truth. Humanity was no longer the apex predator on its own planet. By January 1st, 2026, every major nation on Earth would be operating under martial law. Not because of civil unrest, though that would come later, but because governments would realize that they could no longer guarantee the basic security they had promised their citizens for generations. The Pacific disaster would mark the moment when humanity's illusion of control over its own destiny was completely shattered. But this first warning, devastating as it was nothing compared to what would follow. As the image of the burning ships faded from my sight, Jesus prepared to show me the second catastrophe, one that would strike at the very heart of modern civilization. "Mark," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, What you saw in the Pacific is only a beginning. The second warning will come exactly 21 days later on January 4th, 2026. If the first warning destroys confidence and military might, the second will destroy confidence in everything else. The scene around us transformed again, and I found myself looking down upon the world, interconnected by a web of invisible threads of light. These threads, I understood without being told, represented the digital infrastructure that holds modern civilization together. Banking networks, communication systems, power grids, transportation control systems, all woven into a complex fabric that most people never think about, but without which they cannot survive. As I watched, these threads began to flicker. One by one, the connections that had carried the lifeblood of global commerce for decades began to fail. But this was not a gradual breakdown or a series of random glitches. This was a coordinated, precise, surgical act. Someone or something was methodically dismantling the digital nervous system of human civilization. The attack began at 3:03 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I was somehow able to witness it from multiple perspectives simultaneously. In New York, traders who had come in early for the market open found their screens completely black. ATMs across the city displayed error messages in languages that did not exist. Cell phone towers went silent, one by one, creating zones of digital silence that spread like a plague. But it wasn't just New York. London's financial district descended into chaos as the London Stock Exchange ceased to exist in the digital space. Tokyo's bullet trains stopped dead as their control systems failed catastrophically. In Paris, the power grid began to turn on and off in patterns that spelled out warnings in binary code that no human had ever programmed. Jesus directed my vision deeper into the heart of the crisis, to the hidden infrastructure that keeps modern life functional. Data centers, humming with the processing power of thousands of servers, suddenly fell silent. Submarine cables carrying intercontinental internet traffic went dark. Satellite networks that had worked flawlessly for decades began broadcasting signals that human technology could not decipher. The most terrifying aspect was the intelligence behind the attack. This was not random destruction or sophisticated hacking. Every system that failed was chosen for maximum psychological impact. Credit cards stopped working as people tried to buy emergency supplies. Emergency services found their dispatch systems frozen, just as panic began to spread. News networks lost the ability to broadcast just when accurate information was most desperately needed. I watched as cities turned into zones of chaos within hours. In Los Angeles, traffic management systems failed during rush hour, creating a gridlock that trapped millions of people in their cars in an environment where rumors spread through the only network still working, the human voice and human fear. In Chicago, elevators and skyscrapers stopped working, trapping thousands of office workers in towers that had become vertical prisons. The collapse of the banking system was total and instantaneous. Not just online banking, but the fundamental transfer protocols that allowed money to move between institutions. For the first time since the invention of electronic currency, money ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Credit cards became useless plastic. Bank accounts became numbers in a database that no longer functioned. The entire concept of digital wealth evaporated overnight. Jesus showed me the human cost of this technological apocalypse. Hospitals, where life support systems failed and backup generators could not compensate for the complexity of modern medical equipment. Retirement homes, where elderly patients found themselves locked in when electronic locks engaged and would not release. Airports where planes remained grounded, not due to mechanical failure, but because the computers governing air traffic control had been replaced by something that spoke only in mathematical riddles. But perhaps the most chilling scene was the reaction of world governments. Emergency meetings where leaders discovered that their secure communication networks had been compromised for months, perhaps years. Military command centers where generals realized their most secret systems were displaying information that they themselves had never entered. Secrets that no foreign power should have been able to obtain. The second warning would last for exactly 72 hours. For 3 days, the digital world would remain dark, with analog systems struggling to compensate for the loss of electronic infrastructure. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything would return to normal. Banks would go back online, communication would resume, and the lights would come back on. But nothing would be the same, because during that 72 hours of darkness, people would realize how completely dependent they had become on systems they didn't fully understand, systems controlled by entities that could shut them down at will. The social contract between citizen and government, based on the promise of security and stability, would be revealed as nothing more than an illusion maintained by machines. Trust, the invisible foundation that holds complex societies together, would begin to crumble. People would hoard cash that could become worthless, stock up on food that could spoil, and question every assurance from authorities who had just proven their utter inability to maintain the most basic functions of modern life. And afterward, as investigators tried to trace the source of the global digital catastrophe, they would discover something that would fundamentally shake the scientific community. The attack had not come from any known technology. The programs that had infiltrated every computer system on Earth were not written in any programming language humanity had ever developed. It was something else entirely, an intelligence operating on principles that violated every assumption about artificial intelligence and digital systems. As the image of the dark cities and malfunctioning systems began to fade, Jesus turned to me. "The first warning will destroy confidence in physical security," he said. "The second will destroy confidence in the systems that govern daily life, but the third warning, Mark, will destroy confidence in reality itself." As he spoke those words, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. The first two warnings, however catastrophic, still operated within the bounds of what was possible. Military technology could advance beyond current understanding. Computer systems could, theoretically, be compromised by sufficiently sophisticated hackers. But the third warning would transcend the limits of the natural world entirely. The vision that followed showed the sky itself transforming into something that would force every person on Earth to confront the existence of powers beyond their comprehension. January 21st, 2026. The winter solstice. A date that in any other year would pass unnoticed, remembered only by astronomers and ancient calendar enthusiasts. But Jesus showed me that this date would mark the moment when the veil between the natural and supernatural worlds would be completely torn, forcing every person on Earth to confront the reality of powers beyond their grasp. The third warning began differently from the others, which had earthly origins, even if guided by another worldly intelligence. This final sign would come directly from the divine realm. As the vision unfolded before me, I found myself far above Earth, looking down at the planet as if from the edge of space. It was 6:30 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time when it began. The sun had just risen over London, was setting over Los Angeles, casting the world in the familiar pattern of light and shadow that had marked human days for millennia. But as I watched, something impossible began to happen. A second sun appeared in the sky. Not a reflection, not an optical illusion, not some kind of atmospheric event that scientists could explain. Literally, a second sun burning with the same intensity as the first, but emitting a completely different light. While our familiar star cast a yellow-white illumination, this new celestial body pulsed with a silver fire that seemed to pierce not just the atmosphere, but the soul of anyone who looked upon it. Jesus stood beside me in that impossible vantage point. His presence was more solid and real than the planet revolving beneath us. "Watch closely, Mark," he said. "What you now see will be visible to every person on Earth simultaneously, regardless of time zone, regardless of weather, regardless of any natural law that should make such a thing impossible. For exactly 72 hours, humanity will see the heavens proclaim what has always been true." The second sun followed no orbital mechanics I could understand. It hung motionless above every point on Earth simultaneously, visible with equal clarity to people in broad daylight, where the midday sun was already present, and to those experiencing midnight. In New York, office workers stumbled out of buildings, pointing at the impossible sight blazing above, even though the noon sun was already present. In Tokyo, where it should have been midnight, people woke up to silver light streaming through their windows, as if dawn had come 12 hours early. But this was only the beginning of the third warning. As the hours passed, the second sun began to pulse in patterns that were unmistakably deliberate. Long bursts, short bursts, sequences that repeated with mathematical precision. I realized I was witnessing a cosmic message, transmitted in a language older than human civilization, yet somehow understood by every person who witnessed it. The message was simple and terrifying. The time of harvest has arrived. Social media networks, still fragile from the digital collapse in January, were flooded with images and videos that defied every attempt at rational explanation. Astronomers around the world aimed their most powerful telescopes at the phenomenon, only to discover that their instruments could not focus on it properly. The second sun looked different through every lens, every filter, every scientific device designed to study celestial bodies. It was as if it existed partially outside the spectrum of physical reality. Governments went to extreme lengths to provide explanations that would not cause mass panic. Solar flares, they announced. Unusual atmospheric conditions, rogue experimental military technology, but their explanations fell apart as quickly as they were presented. Solar flares do not create stationary objects in the sky. Atmospheric conditions do not affect all points of Earth simultaneously, and no military on Earth possessed the technology to project images visible from space. Religious leaders around the world found themselves in the spotlight, with millions of terrified people demanding answers. Some proclaimed the second sun a sign of divine favor, others an omen of judgment. But from my elevated perspective in the vision, I could see that both were partially correct and completely missing the point. This was not about favor or judgment, it was about revelation, the ultimate removal of any doubt about the spiritual nature of reality. Jesus showed me specific places around the world where the effect was most profound. In Vatican City, Pope Francis knelt in St. Peter's Square as the silver light illuminated the ancient stones with a supernatural glow. His words, broadcast live to billions of viewers, would be simple and devastating. The time of signs and wonders has returned. Prepare your hearts, for what was prophesied is now upon us. In Jerusalem, at the Western Wall, Orthodox Jews who had prayed there for decades found themselves weeping uncontrollably as the second sun cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any earthly light source. Ancient Hebrew prayers, forgotten for centuries, spontaneously poured from their lips in languages they did not consciously know. In Mecca, millions of pilgrims performing the Hajj stopped mid-prayer as the silver fire reflected off the Kaaba in patterns that spelled out verses from the Quran that had yet to be written. Islamic scholars would struggle for months to understand how the light could form Arabic script in the air above Islam's holiest site. But the most significant reactions came from unexpected places. In Silicon Valley, tech executives who had dedicated their careers to dismissing spiritual matters as primitive superstition could not explain what their satellites and computers were recording. In Beijing, Communist Party leaders who had based their entire worldview on materialist philosophy held emergency meetings as their instruments detected energy signatures that defied every known law of physics and astronomy. The second sun affected different people in different ways, and Jesus showed me the pattern in crystal clarity. Those who had hardened their hearts against spiritual truth experienced the light as oppressive, almost unbearable. Atheist professors canceled classes, unable to look at the sky without feeling a cosmic weight of judgment. Politicians who had built careers on deception found themselves physically ill when they tried to naturally deny the phenomenon. But for others, the silver fire brought something completely different. Christians who had been lukewarm in their faith felt an awakening they hadn't experienced in years of church attendance. Backsliders who hadn't prayed in decades found themselves on their knees, tears streaming down their faces as the light burned away years of spiritual compromise. Most remarkable, people who had never considered religious faith began to have visions and dreams that led them directly to the truth. In college dorms across America, students who had mocked Christianity found themselves reading the Bible with a desperate hunger. In retirement homes, elderly people who had lived their entire lives as secular humanists began to ask for pastors and clergy. In schools across America, teachers found their lesson plans abandoned as 8-year-olds explained complex theological concepts with with a wisdom that exceeded their seminary training. When the third day of the phenomenon arrived, January 23rd, the second sun reached the climax of its supernatural display, and something unprecedented occurred. The silver light began to coalesce into recognizable forms, visible to everyone on Earth simultaneously. First, angels appeared in the sky, not the cherubic figures of Renaissance paintings, but beings of such power and majesty that every person looking up instantly understood them to be warriors from another realm. Their wings seemed to span miles. Their faces shone with a light that made the sun dim, and their presence filled every observer with a combination of dread and worship that brought millions to their knees. Then, at the center of the angelic host, a throne materialized, resembling crystallized light. It hung impossibly suspended in the sky, yet it remained perfectly stable and solid. And upon that throne sat a figure whose face was too bright to be looked upon directly, but whose presence was unmistakable, the Ancient of Days, the eternal judge of all creation. Jesus turned to me as this final vision unfolded. This is the final warning, Mark. For 72 hours, the spiritual realm will be visible to every human eye. After this moment, no one can claim ignorance of divine reality. The separation between those who belong to me and those who do not will become absolute. The psychological impact on global society was instantaneous and total. Stock markets didn't just crash. They ceased to function as traders, abandoned their posts to deal with the cosmic crisis unfolding above. Transportation systems ground to a halt as pilots, drivers, and captains found themselves unable to concentrate on earthly navigation when celestial beings filled the sky. Emergency rooms were flooded with people suffering from what doctors could only describe as spiritual shock, not physical ailments, but a profound psychological reaction to witnessing the manifestation of the supernatural realm. Mental health facilities reported a tenfold surge in admissions as people struggled to process what their worldview insisted was impossible. But perhaps the most significant effect was on children. Unburdened by adult skepticism and scientific materialism, young people around the world began to speak languages they had never learned, prophesy events they could not possibly know, and display spiritual gifts that left their parents speechless. In schools across America, teachers found their lesson plans abandoned as 8-year-olds explained complex theological concepts with a wisdom that exceeded their seminary training. World governments attempted coordinated responses, but their efforts only highlighted their utter helplessness in the face of supernatural intervention. Military leaders discovered that their radar systems detected the angels as solid objects, but weapons aimed at them simply passed through as if shooting at mirages. Scientists held emergency conferences to develop theories that could explain the phenomenon, but their instruments provided data that contradicted every known principle of physics and astronomy. When the 72 hours ended and the second sun and the angelic host finally vanished from sight, humanity had been fundamentally changed. The old categories of believer and non-believer were replaced by new distinctions: those who surrendered to the truth they had witnessed, and those who desperately tried to convince themselves it was a mass hallucination. Jesus showed me the immediate aftermath of the third warning. Churches that had been empty for years were now overflowing with desperate seekers of spiritual guidance. Seminary enrollments surged by 5,000% as young people abandoned secular careers to pursue ministry. Confessionals, unused for decades, were booked weeks in advance as people sought to reconcile themselves with a God they could no longer deny. But there was also a darker reaction. Governments worldwide, fearing that the mass spiritual awakening would lead to the collapse of secular authority, began implementing emergency measures designed to suppress religious expression. Universities fired professors who acknowledged the supernatural nature of what had happened. Media companies launched coordinated campaigns to convince people they had experienced a shared psychological episode rather than genuine divine revelation. The division Jesus had prophesied was becoming visible in every aspect of human society. Families were split along spiritual lines as some members embraced the truth, while others retreated deeper into materialistic denial. Marriages ended when spouses found themselves on opposite sides of the ultimate question. Was what they witnessed real, or was humanity suffering from a collective delusion? Most tragically, Jesus showed me those who had hardened their hearts past the point of no return. Even after seeing the angels and the throne of the heavens with their own eyes, they chose to believe elaborate conspiracy theories rather than surrender to divine authority. Scientists published papers claiming the phenomenon was holographic projections. Politicians blamed foreign governments for psychological warfare. Religious leaders in liberal denominations taught that the visions were metaphorical, not literal. As the vision of the third warning concluded, Jesus turned to me with eyes containing both infinite compassion and terrible urgency. The time of grace ends here, Mark. After the third warning, when every person on earth has seen the reality of the spiritual realm with their own eyes, the harvest will begin. Those who have prepared themselves will be taken up. Those who have not will remain to face the aftermath as the old world ends and the new one begins. The rapture, exactly 9 months after your experience in the desert, and exactly 73 days before the third warning, will happen on December 10th, 2025, he continued. Believers will be removed from what is to come, but those who reject the warnings will experience the full weight of divine judgment as the old world ends and then the new one begins. I felt myself being pulled back towards my physical body. But Jesus was not finished with me. He had one last revelation to share, a final piece of the puzzle that would complete my understanding of why I was chosen for this task. Mark, he said, his voice carrying the weight of eternity. You were not chosen because of your military service, though it prepared you for what you must endure. You were chosen because, despite years of combat and hardship, your heart remained gentle toward the truth. What you have seen will cost you everything you once valued, but it will save souls that would otherwise perish in ignorance. As Jesus spoke those final words, I felt the crushing weight of a responsibility settle upon me, like a cloak I would never be able to remove. The visions I had witnessed were not merely prophecies to be remembered. They were urgent warnings that had to be delivered while there was still time. Every day I remained silent. I would have blood on my hands. Every soul that perished unprepared would be a burden I would carry forever. The return to my physical body was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Imagine trying to pour an ocean into a teacup, the immensity of eternity being compressed back into the limits of flesh and bone. The pain was not just physical, but spiritual. My expanded consciousness was being forced back into the constraints of mortal existence, and I opened my eyes to the harsh fluorescent lights of a military hospital. Around me, machines beeped like electronic prayers for the dead. A young Navy medic was checking my vitals, his face registering astonishment when he realized I was conscious and lucid. According to the medical records, I had been clinically dead for 14 minutes and in a coma for 3 days. My brain scans showed massive trauma that should have been permanently vegetative, but I was completely lucid, more aware than I had ever been in my life. The doctors called it a medical miracle. I knew it was something far more significant than that. The first person I told was Father Rodriguez, a Catholic priest who had served wounded Marines for over 20 years. He sat by my hospital bed, listening with growing astonishment as I recounted every detail of my encounter with Jesus and the 3 warnings I had witnessed. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. His weather-beaten hands were clasped tightly in prayer. "Mark," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "What you have told me aligns with prophecies I have studied for decades. The sequence, the timing, the nature of the warnings. This is not the product of a traumatized mind. This is divine revelation." Hours after regaining consciousness, I knew my life as a Marine was over. Not because of my injuries, which were supernaturally and completely healed, but because I had been assigned to a different kind of service. I tendered my resignation from active duty, a decision met with astonishment by my commanding officers and disappointment from my colleagues who had always seen me as a lifer. The hardest part was looking into the eyes of my wife, Maria, and telling her what had happened. For years, she was my safe harbor, the woman who endured my absence during 3 deployments to the Middle East, the fear, the sleepless nights, wondering if I would ever return. Our life had always been built on certainties. I was the strong, stable Marine, the immovable constant who never faltered, who always knew what to do in any situation. She knew who I was. She knew what to expect from me. But the man who returned from the Arizona desert on June 30th, 2025 was not that man anymore. When I told her about my death and what I saw before Jesus, I watched her face change. It wasn't just grief, it was fear. She looked at me as if she saw a stranger, not the husband she knew. She no longer saw the granite soldier who faced fire without blinking. She saw a different man, less certain, with eyes that had seen too much, speaking with an almost supernatural calm and uttering words that sounded like a prophet's, words that no Marine would ever say. The world is about to change. We must prepare. Time is short. Seeing me so changed terrified her, and how could I blame her? If the roles had been reversed, I too would have thought something in the mind of the person I loved had broken. She told me almost in a whisper, "I need time to understand who you are now, Mark, to understand if the man I married is still in there somewhere. Maybe the children should also stay away for a while until all this makes sense." I did not respond with anger. I did not judge her because I remembered the very words Jesus had spoken to me during the vision. Not everyone will understand right away. Your loved ones will be afraid, but fear not. They will come to you and to the Father when they see the truth, and then nothing will ever separate you again. So I stepped back, not to abandon them, never that, but to give them the space they needed. It was not a goodbye, but a test, a temporary separation that I knew would heal in due time. Maria is not a woman of little faith. She is simply a wife and mother who saw the man she loved return from the desert as someone she no longer recognized, and that frightened her to death. However, I am not afraid, because I know that every word I heard that day is true. And when the signs begin to manifest and the world faces the realities I saw, I know the Lord will fulfill what he promised. Maria and my children will understand, and then everything that seems divided today will be reunited. Just 5 days ago, on July 15th, I was baptized again, not as an empty ritual, not as a tradition to be respected, but as a sign that everything I was before had been left behind. Every fear, every compromise, every part of me that lived only for duty and not for God was buried under that water. Since that day, I haven't picked up a microphone, stood on a pulpit, or sought the spotlight. I've spent every waking hour in prayer and fasting, asking Jesus to guide me, because what I have to share is not a story to be told with curiosity. It is an urgent message, a call to awakening. What I saw before Jesus on June 30th, 2025 was not a dream. It was not a symbol to be interpreted. They were scenes of the future, clear as if I were walking through them, and they are about to begin. The time of grace is shorter than anyone imagines. It is time to wake up, to look into your heart and ask yourself, if Jesus returned tomorrow, would I be ready, or would I be found distracted, immersed in the things of the world, unprepared? What is coming will not only be a moment of fear for the nations, but also an opportunity for grace for those who choose to respond. Many ask me, Mark, how do we know when all this will begin? And I say, do not look for dates on calendars. Look for signs in your heart. You will feel the urgency of the Holy Spirit pushing you to prepare, to leave hidden sins behind, to reconcile with God and with the people you have hurt. Because when the signs become visible, it will already be too late to start preparing. If you are listening to these words, do not let them pass as just another voice among thousands. I am here alive by grace to tell you that the time we have left is short, and that what Jesus showed me is about to begin. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next warnings we will publish as events approach. Write in the comments the country you are following us from. We will pray for your nation that it may find mercy when the heavens shake. And share this message with anyone you love, even with those who do not believe. There will be no second chance when the signs begin. Every passing day brings us one step closer to what I saw. Do not remain indifferent. Do not be found unprepared. Jesus is calling those who have ears to hear, and today that voice has reached you.